You know, we often hear schizophrenia called a mysterious disorder. And the first place our minds go is, well, the brain, right? But what if that's only part of the story? What if the real story is much, much bigger? Today, we're going to treat this like a detective case, following the clues to uncover a story that's more complex and honestly, more hopeful than you might think. So let's start with this. This is the big question we're tackling. For so long, the hunt for what causes schizophrenia was all about genetics, brain chemistry, but that approach, it left huge gaps in our understanding. So we're going to broaden the search. We're going to look for clues hidden in plain sight, in the world all around us.
Okay, so every good detective story needs a detective, right? Well, our detective is a whole field of science called epidemiology. Now, instead of just interviewing one suspect, epidemiologists look at entire populations. They're pattern seekers. They ask who gets sick, where do they live, and when does it happen? This is how you spot clues that are totally invisible if you're just looking at one person at a time.
And we're going to get even more specific. We're using a tool called social epidemiology. The mission is right there in the name. It's all about understanding the link between our social world, where we live, the stress we're under, our communities, and how that shapes our health. It's an incredibly powerful way to look at something like schizophrenia.
All right, our investigation is officially on. First things first, we're going to zoom all the way out. We're looking for the biggest, broadest patterns out there. What do the clues tell us when we look at entire cities, even countries? And what we find, it's pretty striking. And here's our first major clue. It sounds simple, but it's actually profound. Your geography matters. Yeah, the environment you're born into has a real, measurable impact on your risk of developing schizophrenia down the road. And get this, the link is really specific. We're talking about a risk that's 1.5 to almost 2.5 times higher just for being born in a city. That's not a small difference, right? It's a huge statistical signal telling us that something about the urban environment is playing a role. And that just leads to the next big question. What is it, and when does this all start? So if being in a city is a factor, when does that risk kick in? Is it something that happens in childhood or maybe adolescence? Well, the evidence suggests we need to rewind the clock way, way further back. And this is where our investigation takes a really dramatic turn. We're basically becoming time travelers, going all the way back to the very beginning of a person's life. Because it turns out, some of the most critical clues aren't found in the outside world at all. They're found in the 9 months of pregnancy. Okay, so check this out. This is our evidence file. This table is the result of decades of research, and it lists all these environmental factors, things that happen right before or during birth that are linked to schizophrenia. Let's just pull out a few of the most powerful examples here. Okay, look at this. If an expectant mother gets the flu, her child's risk doubles. If it's rubella, the risk skyrockets by more than 5 times. Now, this suggests that it's the mother's own immune response to the virus that can actually affect how the fetus's brain develops, creating this vulnerability that might not show up for years and years. Wow, this one is it's one of the most incredible and, frankly, tragic findings. The extreme stress a mother goes through when losing a spouse during pregnancy, that's associated with a 6.2 times higher risk for her child. This is such a powerful clue that severe stress can have these deep, long-lasting biological impacts on a developing baby. And the risks don't just stop once the baby is born. Complications during delivery, things that might cause brain damage, are linked to a 7-fold increase in risk. It just goes to show how incredibly vulnerable the brain is during that critical moment of entering the world. So let's step back and look at the whole picture here. We're talking about infections, intense stress, complications at birth. These aren't just abstract numbers on a chart. The source calls them environmental insults, events that disrupt development when a person is most fragile. And this just completely changes how we think about the mystery, right? It's not just about your genes, it's about the environment your brain actually grew up in. Okay, so when you see all these different potential causes, from where you're born to what happens before you're born, it forces you to ask a much, much deeper question. If people can get to a diagnosis of schizophrenia from so many different directions, what does that actually say about the diagnosis itself? What is schizophrenia really? And this quote, this gets right to the heart of it. Researchers are basically asking, how can we even be sure that this diagnosis we call schizophrenia is one single valid thing? Is it one clear-cut disease like measles? Or is it something else entirely? So this really lays out the two competing ways of thinking about it. On the one hand, you have the traditional view. Schizophrenia is like a box. You're either in the box or you're not. But all this evidence we've been looking at, it points to the idea on the right that psychotic experiences are more like a spectrum, a continuum, that actually stretches out into the normal population. And in this view, schizophrenia isn't some totally separate disease. It's just the name we gave to the most severe end of that spectrum.
And this new way of thinking, which, came out of all our detective work, it leads us to the most important part of this whole story, the future. Because if we know that there are specific, identifiable things in the environment that increase the risk, well, that opens up an incredibly hopeful possibility. Could we actually intervene?
And the answer, based on all this evidence, is a huge yes. This isn't just wishful thinking. It's a direct conclusion from the research. As the source material says so beautifully, the prevention of schizophrenia is not an impossible dream.
So what does that mean? It means we're past the point of just identifying problems. This knowledge gives us a responsibility. The source talks about an urgent need to actually design and test ways to help. Things like better prenatal care, more support for mothers under extreme stress, finding ways to reduce birth complications. These aren't just nice public health ideas. They could literally be schizophrenia prevention strategies.
And that's where our detective story ends, with one last huge question. We've got the map, we've seen the clues, we know the path toward prevention is there. So the challenge isn't just scientific anymore. It's a question for all of us. Now that we know all this, what are we going to do about it?